The air on the 64th floor always tasted like nothing. It was filtered, chilled, and stripped of any scent that might remind the occupants of the world outside. For Julian, this was the only way to breathe. He sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of obsidian, staring out at the city that looked less like a collection of people and more like a circuit board. He had finally learned how to program. Julian wasn't a man who believed in ghosts, but he believed in ghosts of industry. He believed in the way a skyline could be bent to a man's will if that man was willing to sacrifice enough sleep, enough relationships, and enough of his own skin. Today, however, his will was being tested by something so small it was almost insulting. On his desk lay a map. It was a beautiful digital rendering of the Vance Heights project, a 3-block radius of glass, steel, and greenery that would redefine the city's center. But right in the middle of that map, like a dead pixel on a high-definition screen, was a tiny brown square. It was a house. A single, 2-story cottage with a sagging porch and a garden that refused to die. "She won't take the offer?" Julian asked. His voice was low, a habit he'd developed to make people lean in, to make them work to hear him. His assistant, a man named Arthur who had mastered the art of looking busy while standing perfectly still, shook his head. "We went up to 12 million, Julian. That's 10 times the land value." She didn't even open the envelope. She just told the courier that the paper would be better used for starting a fire. Julian didn't get angry. Anger was a leak in the tank of productivity. Instead, he felt a strange, itching curiosity. He was 45 years old, and in his world, everyone had a number. He had bought out rival CEOs, silenced critics, and negotiated with city councils that were supposedly uncorruptible. Everyone took the envelope eventually. "Who is she?" Julian asked, standing up and walking to the window. "Her name is Mrs. Alara. She's lived there for 58 years. No living relatives we can find? No debt. No medical history that suggests she's desperate for cash. She just lives there." Julian looked down. From this height, he couldn't see the house. He could only see the shadow of his own tower stretching across the neighborhood. He felt a sudden, sharp need to see the woman who valued a drafty old house more than a life of luxury. He didn't trust his lawyers to handle this anymore. They were hunters who only knew how to use traps. Julian was a man who knew how to look a person in the eye and find where they were soft. "Cancel my dinner with the board," Julian said, grabbing his coat. It was a charcoal cashmere blend that cost more than most people's cars. "I'm going for a walk." The transition from the penthouse to the street level was always a shock to the system. The humidity of the late afternoon hit Julian like a physical weight. As he walked toward the construction site, the sounds of the city began to change. The polite hum of the business district gave way to the screech of drills and the rhythmic thumping of pile drivers. His security detail followed at a distance. As instructed, Julian wanted to appear like a neighbor, even though he looked like he had stepped off a yacht as he reached the perimeter of the construction zone. The contrast became absurd. On 3 sides, giant yellow cranes loomed like prehistoric birds, tearing at the earth. Huge concrete barriers cordoned off the dust and noise. But in the center, behind a rusted wrought iron fence, the cottage stood. It looked defiant. The grass was long and vibrant green, dotted with wildflowers that shouldn't have been able to grow in the shadow of skyscrapers. There was a rocking chair on the porch, and a wind chime made of old silver spoons that tinkled softly despite the roar of the machinery. Nearby, Julian felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't guilt. He had outgrown that long ago. It was a sense of displacement. This house reminded him of something he had spent 20 years trying to forget. The sound of a screen door slamming in the summer. The smell of rain on hot asphalt, the feeling of having nowhere to go and being perfectly fine with that. He pushed open the gate. It creaked, a sharp, metallic protest against his intrusion, as he walked up the stone path. It was an atmospheric trick, he told himself. The house was shielded by the surrounding buildings, creating a pocket of silence. But as he stepped onto the wooden porch, the silence deepened. It wasn't the empty silence of his office. It was a heavy, expectant silence. like the pause between a lightning flash and the thunder. He reached the front door. It was made of heavy oak, the grain worn smooth by decades of hands. Julian took a breath, adjusted his cuffs, and knocked. He expected a frail, shaking hand to open the door. He expected to see a woman confused by the world moving too fast around her. He was wrong. The door opened slowly, but with intention. There was no chain, no cautious peek. Mrs. Alara stood there, her back straight, wearing a simple floral dress that looked like it had been washed 1,000 times. Her hair was a cloud of white, but her eyes, they were a piercing, crystalline blue that didn't seem to belong to an old woman. They looked like the eyes of someone who had seen everything and decided that none of it was particularly impressive. "You're the one who builds the towers," she said. Her voice wasn't cracked. It was soft, like the sound of wind through tall grass, but it carried a weight that stopped Julian's heart for half a beat. "Ack!" "I'm Julian," he said, extending a hand. "I believe we have some things to discuss." She didn't take his hand. She didn't look at his suit. She looked directly into his eyes, and for the first time in his professional life, Julian felt the urge to look away. "I've been expecting you, Julian," she said, stepping back to let him in. "I think you're here because you've forgotten what a floor feels like when it isn't made of glass." Julian stepped over the threshold, and as the door closed behind him, the sound of the city vanished completely. The moment Julian stepped into the hallway, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. But it wasn't the artificial chill of an air conditioner. It was the coolness of deep shade, the kind you find under an old tree in the middle of July. He stood in the entryway, his polished shoes feeling loud and clumsy on the braided rug that covered the floorboards. He waited for her to lead him into a living room or a kitchen, but she simply walked ahead with a slow, steady gait that suggested she knew every inch of this space by heart. The interior of the house was a maze of shadows and soft light. There were no bright LED bulbs here. Instead, the evening sun filtered through lace curtains, casting intricate patterns on the walls. Julian noticed that the walls weren't covered in the expensive, abstract art he favored. They were covered in memories. Small, framed photographs of people laughing at picnics. A shelf full of hand-carved wooden animals. And stacks of books with spines so worn the titles had faded into the leather. "Sit," she said. Gesturing toward a heavy wooden chair near a small circular table, Julian sat. He tried to maintain his power posture, back straight, hands folded, the look of a man who was ready to negotiate a merger. But the chair was deep and smelled of beeswax and lavender. It forced him to lean back, to sink into its frame. It was a chair designed for resting, not for fighting. "Mrs. Alara," Julian began, using his most professional tone. "I'll get straight to the point. I think there's been a misunderstanding about the value of this property. My team tells me you aren't interested in the money, but I find that everyone is interested in what money can buy. Security, comfort, a legacy for those you leave behind." She was standing by a small stove, placing a kettle on the burner. She didn't turn around when he spoke. "You talk about legacy as if it's something you build out of concrete, Julian. You think that if you put your name on a building, people will remember who you were. But a name on a building is just a target for the wind and the rain. Eventually, it washes away." Julian frowned. He wasn't used to being lectured, especially not by someone who looked like they lived on the budget of a retired librarian. That may be true in 1,000 years. But today, it means something. It means jobs. It means progress, and it means a level of wealth that could change your life. You could live anywhere in the world. You could have a staff to take care of you. Why stay here in the middle of a construction zone where the dust never settles? The kettle began to whistle a low, mournful sound that grew into a sharp cry. She lifted it with a steady hand and poured water into 2 ceramic mugs. She brought them over to the table and sat across from him. There was no sugar, no cream, just the dark, earthy scent of tea. "I stay here because the dirt under this house knows me," she said softly. "When I walk across this floor at night, I'm not just walking on wood. I'm walking on the echoes of the people I loved. My husband built this porch. My son learned to crawl on this rug. If I take your $12 million and move to a penthouse with a view of the ocean, who will I be? I will be a stranger in a beautiful cage. Julian felt a flicker of impatience. That's sentimentalism. It's a powerful emotion, but it doesn't pay the bills. It doesn't protect you from the reality that the world is changing around you. Look out your window. My towers are coming. This house is a relic. It's an island in a sea of glass. Mrs. Alara took a slow sip of her tea. She didn't look offended. She looked at him with a kind of pity that made Julian's skin crawl. It was the way a doctor looks at a patient who doesn't realize they are sick. You think I'm the one who is trapped, Julian? She asked. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it seemed to fill the room. I look at you and I see a man who hasn't tasted his food in years. I see a man who checks his watch every 3 minutes because he is afraid that time is running out. You have all the money in the world, but you are the poorest person I have ever met. Julian laughed, a short, sharp sound that felt brittle in the quiet room. I'm poor. I have assets in 5 countries. I have a jet that can take me anywhere on Earth in ours. I have influence over the way this city grows. I think your definition of poverty is a bit skewed. Is it? She replied. She leaned forward, her blue eyes locking onto his. Tell me, Julian. When was the last time you felt a genuine moment of peace? Not the satisfaction of a deal closed. Not the thrill of winning, but peace. The kind of peace where you aren't thinking about the next hour, or the next million, or the next person you have to impress. Julian opened his mouth to answer, but the words died in his throat. He searched his memory. He thought of his luxury apartment, his high-end cars, his expensive dinners. They were all loud. They were all fast. Even his sleep was a battle, aided by pills and white noise machines. He couldn't remember a single moment in the last decade where his brain hadn't been a buzzing hive of calculations. That's a luxury I can't afford, Julian said, his voice sounding defensive even to his own ears. The world I live in doesn't stop for peace. If you stop, you get trampled. And that is why you are afraid, she said. Julian stiffened. I'm not afraid of anything. You are, she insisted, her voice as soft as a falling leaf. You are terrified. You're terrified that if you stop building, if you stop running, you'll have to look at yourself in the mirror and realize that there is nothing left inside. You've traded your soul for a collection of things, and now you're realizing that the things don't love you back. The room seemed to grow darker, though the sun hadn't set yet. Julian felt a strange sensation in his chest, a tightness he hadn't felt since he was a child. It was the feeling of being caught in a lie. He wanted to get up and walk out. He wanted to call his security and tell them to bulldoze the place tomorrow, regardless of the legalities. He had the power to do it, but he couldn't move. There was something about the way she looked at him, not with anger, but with a terrifying, quiet honesty. She wasn't playing a game. She wasn't negotiating. She was stating facts about his life that he had kept hidden, even from himself. You think you're here to buy my house? She continued. But you're really here because you want to know how I can be so happy with so little. You want to know why I'm not afraid of you? Julian looked down at his tea. The steam had stopped rising. The surface was a dark, still mirror. He saw his own reflection, distorted, pale and small. For the first time in his life, the 64th floor felt like it was miles away, and for some reason, he wasn't sure if he ever wanted to go back. I'm here to do a job, Julian whispered, though he didn't sound convinced. No, she said. You're here to remember who you were before the world told you who you should be. She reached across the table and placed her hand near his. She didn't touch him, but he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. It was a grounded physical presence that made his expensive suit feel like a costume. Let me tell you a story, Julian, she said, about a man who once had a garden, and how he lost it because he was too busy counting the seeds. Julian sat in the deepening shadows of the cottage, the roar of the construction outside fading into a dull, distant throb. He found himself listening not as a CEO, not as a millionaire, but as a man who was suddenly, inexplicably, afraid of the silence he had spent his life trying to avoid. Julian didn't move. He felt like a man suspended in deep water, where the pressure was high, but the surface was nowhere to be seen. The shadows in the small kitchen had stretched long across the floor, reaching toward his feet like dark fingers. She wasn't looking at the maps or the legal documents he had brought. She was looking at him as if she could see the boy he used to be. The one who lived in a house with drafty windows and a mother who braided rugs just like the one under his feet. "You had a garden once, didn't you?" she asked. It wasn't a guess. It was a statement. Julian felt a cold prickle at the back of his neck. He hadn't told anyone about his childhood in years. In his official biography, he was the self-made man who came from humble beginnings, a phrase he used to polish his image without ever giving away the details. He didn't talk about the dirt under his fingernails or the way his father's boots sounded on the porch when he came home from the mill, smelling of wood smoke and failure. "Everyone has a past," Julian said, his voice sounding thin. "But the past is a dead weight. I learned a long time ago that if you want to climb, you have to drop everything that slows you down." Mrs. Alara smiled, but there was no joy in it. It was the smile of a teacher watching a student make the same mistake for the 100th time. "You didn't drop it, Julian. You buried it. And things that are buried alive don't stay quiet." She stood up and walked to a small wooden cabinet. From inside, she pulled out a tin box, the kind that used to hold butter cookies. She set it on the table between them. When she opened the lid, it wasn't cookies inside. It was a collection of stones, dried flowers, and old yellowed scraps of paper. "This is my wealth," she said. "Every item in this box represents a moment where I felt truly alive. This pebble is from the river where my brother and I used to catch crawfish. This dried rose is from the first bouquet my husband ever gave me. He didn't have money for a florist, so he picked them from the side of the road. And this," she held up a small rusted key, "is the key to the first shed we built together." Julian looked at the items. To him, they were trash. They were things you threw away during a move. But as he looked at her face, he saw a glow that no diamond or gold watch could ever produce. She looked at that rusted key with more pride than Julian felt when he looked at his stock portfolio. "I'm here to talk about the future," Julian said, trying to regain control of the conversation. "I can give you enough money to fill 1,000 of those boxes with whatever you want. Why cling to these old things? The world out there is moving so fast. Don't you want to be a part of it before it passes you by?" "The world isn't moving fast, Julian," she said, her voice dropping to that soft, vibrating whisper again. "The world is standing still. It's people like you who are running in circles. You think that because you're moving, you're going somewhere. But you're just a hamster on a very expensive wheel. And the fear you feel, the fear you felt when you walked through my door is the realization that the wheel is going to stop one day. And you won't know how to stand on your own 2 feet. Julian felt his heart hammer against his ribs. He wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her about the thousands of people he employed, the buildings that touched the clouds, the way his name was spoken in rooms where the fate of the city was decided. But his throat felt tight. He realized he was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. "Why are you saying these things to me?" he asked. "You don't even know me." "I know the type of man you are," she said. "I've seen men like you for 80 years. You start out wanting to prove something to the world. Maybe you wanted to prove something to a father who never thought you were good enough. Or maybe you wanted to prove it to the kids who laughed at your shoes. But somewhere along the way, the proving became the only thing you knew how to do. You forgot what you were actually trying to achieve." She leaned in closer. The scent of lavender and old paper was overwhelming now. "Tell me, Julian, if you died tonight in that glass tower of yours, who would come to your funeral? Not because they wanted to be seen there. Not because they wanted a piece of your estate. But because they truly loved the man you were when no one was watching?" Julian closed his eyes. He saw the faces of his board members. He saw his ex-wife, who had left him 5 years ago because she said he was only half a person. He saw his daughter, who sent him polite emails twice a year, but never asked to see him. He saw a long line of people in black suits, all checking their watches, waiting for the service to end so they could get back to their own wheels. A wave of nausea hit him. It was a physical reaction to the emptiness she was describing. He had spent his whole life building a fortress, only to realize he was the only prisoner inside it. But it sounded like a plea. "You're a man who is lost in the woods," she replied, "and you've been lost for so long that you've started to think the trees are your friends. But these trees don't give shade, Julian. They're made of steel, and they're cold." She reached into the tin box and pulled out a small, smooth stone. It was a simple river rock, worn down by years of water. She took Julian's hand, his expensive, manicured hand, placed the stone in his palm. She closed his fingers around it. "Hold this," she said. "Feel the weight of it. It doesn't want anything from you. It doesn't care about your money. It just is. It has been here for 1,000,000 years, and it will be here for 1,000,000 more after your towers have crumbled into dust." As Julian sat there, holding the cold stone, a strange thing happened. The noise of the construction outside, the pounding of the machines that he had ordered to be there, began to sound like a heartbeat. But it wasn't a healthy heartbeat. It sounded like a drum roll before an execution. He looked at the old woman, and for a split second, she didn't look like a person anymore. She looked like a mirror. The fear he had been trying to suppress for the last hour finally broke through. It wasn't the fear of losing the deal. It wasn't the fear of failing the board. It was the fear that she was right. It was the terror of realizing that he had reached the top of the mountain, only to find that the air was too thin to breathe, and there was no way back down. "I have to go," Julian said, his voice cracking. He stood up so quickly he nearly knocked the chair over. "You can go," Mrs. Alara said, her voice remaining calm and steady. "But you're taking that fear with you, Julian. You can't leave it here. It's been following you for years." "I just pulled the curtain back so you could see it." Julian didn't look back. He stumbled out of the kitchen, through the dim hallway, and out onto the porch. The sudden glare of the city lights and the roar of the machinery hit him like a physical blow. He scrambled down the stone path, his heart racing, feeling like he was escaping a collapsing building. But as he reached the gate and looked back at the small, quiet cottage sitting in the middle of his empire, he realized he wasn't escaping. He was carrying the weight of that little river stone in his pocket, and for the first time in his life, his 64-story tower looked like the smallest place on earth. Julian didn't run, but he walked with a frantic energy that made his security team exchange worried glances. He didn't wait for them to open the door of the black sedan. He yanked it open himself and slid into the leather seat. The door closed with a heavy, expensive thud, cutting off the sound of the construction. But the silence inside the car wasn't the same as the silence in the cottage. This silence felt pressurized, like he was trapped in a submarine sinking to the bottom of the ocean. "Back to the office," he snapped. As the car pulled away, Julian reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed against the smooth surface of the river stone the old woman had given him. He wanted to throw it out the window. He wanted to toss it into the gutter and watch it disappear into the sewer. But his fingers gripped it tight. It felt like an anchor. It was the only thing in his world right now that felt solid. By the time he reached the lobby of his building, the sun had fully set, and the tower was a pillar of artificial light. Usually, walking through these marble halls made him feel like a king returning to his castle. Tonight, he felt like a ghost. He stepped into the private elevator and watched the numbers climb. 50, 60, 64. His office was waiting for him. Bathed in the soft glow of floor-to-ceiling monitors and city lights, Arthur was still there, standing by the obsidian desk with a stack of folders. "The board called 3 times, Julian," Arthur said, his voice cautious. "They're worried about the timeline. The demolition crew is scheduled to move in on the surrounding lots tomorrow morning. But without the cottage site secured, the foundation work is stalled. They want to know if you got the signature." Julian didn't answer. He walked to the window and looked down. From here, the cottage was invisible, buried in the darkness between the massive construction lights. He imagined the old woman sitting at her table, drinking her tea in the dark, completely unbothered by the man who owned the sky above her. "Julian," Arthur prompted. "We aren't moving the crew in tomorrow," Julian said. His voice sounded strange to him, low and gravelly. Arthur paused, his pen hovering over a notepad. You mean we're delaying the cottage lot? We can still work on the north perimeter, no? Julian said, turning around. Stop it all. Tell the crews to stand down. Tell the board the project is under internal review. Arthur's face went pale. Internal review? Julian, we've already spent $200 million on the acquisition and clearing phases. Julian shouted. The outburst surprised both of them. Julian never shouted. He was a man of cold logic, not hot temper. He took a breath and sat down. But the chair, the $5,000 ergonomic masterpiece, felt like it was made of jagged rocks. He couldn't get comfortable. Do it, Arthur. Tell them I'm not feeling well. Tell them whatever you want. I need the site quiet tomorrow. Arthur hesitated, then nodded and backed out of the room. Julian was alone. He opened his laptop, trying to lose himself in spreadsheets and projections, but the numbers didn't make sense anymore. Every time he looked at a dollar sign, he heard the old woman's whisper, "You've traded your soul," for a collection of things. He had tried to sleep on the sofa in his office, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw those piercing blue eyes of Mrs. Alara. He felt the weight of the stone in his pocket. He felt a fear he couldn't explain. It wasn't the fear of losing his company or going bankrupt. He would be a suit with no person inside it. He spent the night pacing the 64th floor. He looked at his awards on the wall. He looked at the photos of him shaking hands with mayors and governors. He looked for a trace of a smile that reached his eyes in any of them. He found nothing. He was a man who had built a life based on the idea of more. But as the sun began to peek over the horizon, more felt like a suffocating pile of dust. At 7 a.m., his phone began to vibrate. It was the chairman of the board. Julian stared at the phone. He knew what was coming. They would demand answers. They would threaten to remove him. They would talk about fiduciary duty and shareholder value. He picked up the phone, but he didn't call the chairman. He called the site supervisor. "This is Julian Vance," he said. "I'm coming down to the site. I want all the engines turned off. I want every man off the machines." Now, didn't wait for a response. He took the elevator down, bypassed his car, and began to walk. People in business suits hurried past him, their heads down, their eyes fixed on their phones. He saw himself in every one of them, rushing toward a finish line that didn't exist. When he reached the fence of the cottage, the site was silent. The giant yellow cranes stood like skeletons against the morning sky. The workers were huddled near the trailers, whispering and pointing at him. Julian didn't care. He walked to the gate of the cottage. The old woman was already on the porch, rocking in her chair. She didn't look surprised to see him. She looked like she had been waiting for him to finish a very long, very tiring race. Julian stood at the edge of her porch. He looked exhausted. His tie was loose, and his hair was messy. He didn't look like a millionaire. He looked like a man who had been wandering in the desert. "I couldn't sleep," he said, his voice trembling. "The truth is a loud thing when you first hear it," she said. "They're going to take it all away from me," Julian whispered, looking back at the towering buildings around them. "If I don't build this, they'll find someone who will. They'll push me out. I'll have nothing." Mrs. Lara stopped rocking. She stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking down at him. "Julian, you already have nothing. You're just finally noticing the empty space." A cold wind blew through the construction site, whistling through the steel beams of the unfinished towers. Julian felt the fear rise up in his throat, a raw, primal terror of the unknown. He had lived his life by a map, and now the map was gone. He was standing in the dirt, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know what his next move was. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the river stone. He held it out to her, his hand shaking. "I don't want this anymore. It's too heavy." "It's not the stone that's heavy, Julian," she said softly. "It's the life you're trying to carry while holding it. You have to decide what you're going to drop." Julian looked at the stone, then at the massive towers, then at the small woman with the blue eyes. The fear was peaking, a wave about to crash over his head. He realized that this was the moment. He could either walk back to the office and sign the papers to destroy this house, or he could let the wave take him. Julian stood there for a long time. The world around him was waking up. He could hear the distant sound of sirens, the honking of cars, and the low hum of a city that never stopped to ask why it was moving. But inside the fence of the small cottage, everything was still. He looked at the stone in his hand. Then he looked at the massive cranes that hovered over the house like monsters waiting to strike. His voice barely audible over the wind. I lose everything I've spent 20 years building. My name will be a joke in the news. My board will sue me. I'll be the man who went crazy and threw away a billion-dollar dream for a pile of old wood and some dirt. Mrs. Alara didn't look away. She stepped off the porch, her feet hitting the soil with a soft thud. She walked right up to the fence where Julian stood. Is it a dream, Julian? Or is it a debt? You look like a man who has been paying off a debt for 20 years, and the interest just keeps growing. Julian felt a tear sting his eye. He didn't wipe it away. He was too tired to hide anymore. I don't know who I am without the tower. I don't know where to go if I'm not going up. Then stay down here for a while, she said. She reached through the iron bars of the fence and took the stone from his hand. This time, her fingers brushed against his palm. Her skin was warm and rough, like sun-baked earth. The ground is much more interesting than the sky, Julian. Things grow here. Up there, things only harden. Julian looked at his phone. It was vibrating again. The name of the chairman flashed on the screen. It felt like a tether, a golden chain trying to pull him back to the 64th floor. He looked at the phone, then he looked at the old woman. With a sudden, sharp motion, Julian didn't answer the call. He didn't silence it. He simply let go of the phone. It dropped into the mud at the edge of the construction site, the screen flickering one last time before it went dark. The fear didn't vanish, but it changed. It wasn't the cold, sharp fear of a man about to lose a fight. It was the quiet, wide-open fear of a bird leaving a cage. He felt light. He felt terrified. He felt, for the first time in his adult life, completely awake. I'm going to stop the project, Julian said. He wasn't saying it to convince her. He was saying it to hear the truth of it in the air. I'll dissolve the partnership. I'll use my personal funds to settle the debts. I'll probably lose the tower. I'll definitely lose the office. And what will you gain? She asked. Julian looked at the cottage. He saw the peeling paint, the garden full of wild things, and the simple wooden door. He looked at his hands, the hands that had signed away neighborhoods and moved millions of dollars. For the first time, he saw them as just hands. I'll gain the ability to sit in a chair and not feel like I'm waiting for a crash, he said. Julian walked away from the fence, but he didn't go toward the sedan or the office. He walked toward the group of workers standing by the trailers. The supervisor, a man with a weathered face and a hard hat, stepped forward. Sir, what's the word? The board has been calling the site trailer. They're saying we need to start the engines. Julian looked at the man. He noticed the man had a small smudge of grease on his cheek and a wedding ring that was worn thin. He noticed the man looked tired, just like he was. Go home, Julian said. The supervisor blinked. Go home? For how long? We have a schedule, Mr. Vance. The schedule is over, Julian said, his voice gaining strength. The project is canceled. Tell the men they'll be paid for the full month, but tell them to pack up. We're not building here. The silence that followed was heavy. The workers looked at each other, then at the massive pit they had dug, then at the small house in the center. Slowly, one by one, they began to climb down from the machines. The engines that had been idling died out, leaving a silence so profound it felt like the whole city had held its breath. Julian spent the next few months in a blur of meetings, but they weren't the kind he was used to. He sat in small rooms with lawyers who looked at him like he was a madman. He signed papers that stripped away his shares, his bonuses, and his titles. He moved out of the penthouse and into a small apartment on the other side of the city, a place where he could hear the neighbors' music and the sound of dogs barking in the street. He lost his car. his assistant, and his seat at the high-end restaurants. But a strange thing happened. The fear that had gripped him in the cottage didn't eat him alive. Instead, it acted like a fire that burned away everything that wasn't real. One Saturday morning, Julian found himself walking back toward the old neighborhood. It was no longer a construction site. The cranes were gone. The concrete barriers had been removed. The city had decided to turn the surrounding lots into a small public park, a compromise Julian had fought for during his exit. He reached the cottage. It looked exactly the same, but the garden was even more vibrant. Mrs. Alara was on the porch as she always was. She was holding a small trowel, her hands covered in dark, rich soil. Julian stopped at the gate. He wasn't wearing a charcoal suit. He was wearing jeans and a simple cotton shirt. He looked younger, though his hair had more gray in it than before. "I don't have $12 million anymore," Julian said, leaning against the gate. Mrs. Alara looked up and smiled. This time, the smile was bright and full of genuine warmth. "Good. It was making you very hard to talk to." "Found a job," Julian continued. "Teaching business ethics at a small college. It doesn't pay for private jets, but I walked here today. I saw a tree that was starting to bloom. I actually stopped to look at it for 10 minutes. What?" She stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. She walked over and opened the gate. "Well, don't just stand there, Julian. I have a row of tomatoes that need staking, and my back isn't what it used to be. I think it's time you learned how to build something that stays in the ground instead of trying to escape it." Julian stepped inside the garden. He felt the dirt beneath his shoes. He felt the sun on his neck. He looked at the old woman and realized that she had been right all along. The fear wasn't about losing what he had. It was about the terrifying realization that he had never really had anything at all until he let it go. As they worked together in the quiet garden, the city roared on around them, a forest of glass and steel reaching for the clouds. But Julian didn't look up. He was too busy looking at the life right in front of him. For the first time, the millionaire wasn't afraid. He was finally, quietly, at home. A year had passed since Julian first stepped onto the creaky porch of the cottage, and the world he once ruled had moved on without him. In the business journals, he was a cautionary tale of man who lost his mind and walked away from a billion-dollar legacy. But as Julian sat on the wooden steps of the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and bruised purple, he felt more like a man who had finally found his mind. The park surrounding the cottage had matured. What used to be a dusty construction pit was now a stretch of rolling green grass, young oak trees, and winding stone paths. Children played where the heavy machinery once groaned, and their laughter was the only soundtrack Julian cared for now. He was no longer the man in the obsidian tower. He was the man who helped Mrs. Alara fix her fence and keep the squirrels out of the tomatoes. Mrs. Alara came out of the house carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. She moved a bit slower these days, her breath a little shallower, but her eyes remained as sharp as the day she had first dismantled Julian's ego. She handed him a glass and sat in her rocking chair, the rhythmic creak thud of the wood acting like a heartbeat for the house. "You're thinking again, Julian," she said, her voice like soft velvet. "I can hear the gears turning from over here. Stop trying to solve the world. Just drink your juice." Julian smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and crinkled the skin at the corners. "I was just thinking about the anniversary. 1 year since the fall. It's funny how everyone called it a disaster. They talk about me as if I died. But I feel like I only started breathing 12 months ago." They think that if you aren't grabbing for more, you must be losing what you have. They don't realize that your hands have to be empty to truly hold something of value. Their peaceful moment was interrupted by the sound of a car door closing. It wasn't the heavy, muffled thud of a luxury sedan, but the tinny slam of an old beat-up hatchback. A young man stepped out, looking nervous. He was wearing a cheap suit that was a size too big, clutching a briefcase as if it were a shield. He looked exactly like the hundreds of junior analysts Julian used to hire and fire without ever learning their names. The young man approached the gate, hesitating. He looked at the cottage, then at the modern park, then at Julian. Excuse me? I'm looking for Julian Vance. They told me I might find him here. Julian stood up, wiping his hands on his worn trousers. You found him. But if you're looking for a signature or a quote for a magazine, you're in the wrong place. The young man shook his head quickly. No, sir. My name is Leo. I work for the firm that took over your old project. Well, what was left of it? They're struggling, sir. The board is fighting, the investors are pulling out, and nobody knows how to fix the mess. They sent me to offer you a consultant role. A huge salary. They just want your brain back. Julian looked at Leo. He saw the sweat on the boy's forehead, the desperation to succeed. The way he was already looking at his watch, worried about the time. He saw a mirror of his old self, a ghost of a life he had left behind. The one with the red leaves. The young man blinked, confused. The tree? Sir, I'm talking about a 7-figure contract. The board is desperate. I know what they are, Julian said gently. But look at the tree. It doesn't try to grow faster than the one next to it. It doesn't worry about whether it's the tallest tree in the park. It just grows because that's what it was meant to do. When the winter comes, it lets its leaves go. It doesn't try to hold on to them. It trusts that the spring will come again. Leo looked at the tree, then back at Julian. I don't understand. I know you don't, Julian said. Because you're still counting the seeds. Go back to the board. Tell them that Julian Vance is busy. Tell them he's retired from the business of building cages. Tell them he's finally learned how to be a gardener. The young man stood there for a long time, his briefcase sagging. He looked at the old woman on the porch, who gave him a small, knowing nod. He looked at the peaceful park, where the shadows were growing long, and the air smelled like cut grass and rain. For a second, just a second, the tension in Leo's shoulders dropped. He seemed to see, for the first time, that there was a world outside of the spreadsheets. They'll be angry, Leo whispered. They were always angry, Leo, Julian said. That's why they keep building towers. Don't be like them. Go find a park. Sit on a bench. Don't check your phone for an hour. See what happens? Leo nodded slowly, turned around, and walked back to his car. He moved slowly, as if he were carrying something fragile. Julian walked back up to the porch and sat down next to Mrs. Alara. The sun had disappeared now. The streetlights in the park flickered on, glowing like low-hanging stars. You handled that well, she said. I think I finally believe my own lies, Julian joked, taking a sip of the lemonade. They aren't lies, Julian. They're truths that took you 40 years to hear. Out. She reached out and patted his hand. Her touch was lighter now, her strength fading as the seasons changed, but the warmth was still there. I won't be here forever, you know. This house. It's just wood and stone. Eventually, the city will try again. When I'm gone, they'll come with their papers and their lawyers. Julian looked at the small, sturdy house. He looked at the garden they had spent the day tending. He thought about the fear he used to feel. The fear of losing power. The fear of being forgotten. It was gone. In its place was something much stronger, a sense of belonging. Let them come, Julian said. They can take the wood. They can take the stone. But they can't take the peace. And they certainly can't take the stories. I'll stay here as long as the dirt will have me. I'll keep the garden growing. Mrs. Alara closed her eyes, her rocking chair slowing to a stop. Good, because the tomatoes are going to be spectacular this year. And I think the world needs more people who know how to grow things instead of just buying them. The city hummed in the distance. 1,000,000 people chasing 1,000,000 different things. But on that small porch, in the heart of the noise, there was a perfect, golden silence. Julian leaned back, closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life, he didn't care what tomorrow looked like. He was exactly where he was supposed to be.